Okay, today we're going to make paper, and there's a lot of supplies that you're going to want to have when you're making paper. Some things you can do without, some things you just can't. Blender is extremely important when you're recycling paper. And I have two blenders. One's going to be for white paper only. The other blender is going to be for color paper. So I'll get into that in a little bit. I have my own little shredder here. If you've got a bigger shredder, great. This is an old one. It's one of those that go over a trash can or whatever. What I will use is this to shred my paper. Some will get finer cuts, which will make it easier for the pulping process when we get into actually blending. A couple other supplies. You're going to need a tub of water. You need a screen, so basically a frame. This is called a decal and a mold. This is our decal. Okay, it's got a screen on it. All right, and then I've got something on the back here. I'll explain this later. Sometimes this is necessary, sometimes it's not. This is not all my decals have this. So I've got my screen attached. This is basically just fiberglass household screen that I'm using. There is another kind of screen that you can get for paper making. It's a thinner hole. It's a smaller hole, and it'll give you finer pieces of paper, or it'll trap more paper as well. Then you have what's called the mold. So this actually makes the shape of the paper. So you could have a rectangle mold. You can have a mold that's cut into the shape of a dolphin if you wanted, into the shape of a flower, whatever it may be. This is the shape of my paper. Okay, so that's why it's called the mold. So the decal and the mold, and you got to have both of these in order to make a sheet of paper. And this is roughly a 4x6, maybe a 5x8 sheet of paper right here. And then I've got a bigger one that we're going to use today. This is a 12x12. So this will be a 12x12 sheet of paper that I'm going to make. So I've got my decal here. As you can see, it doesn't have that white screen on the back. It's just the basic fiberglass screen on the front. And then I've got my mold. This is just 1x2 wood that I got at Home Depot. So just 1x2, stapled it together, nothing fancy. You can use canvas bars, stretching bars if you want to. That's up to you, depending on what you find to be cheaper. I think an 8-foot piece of this cost me like $2 or something. So, and I was able to make out of 3, so $6 worth, I was able to make 4 of these with one mold. So, or 4 decals in one mold. All right, and then, so to get started, what we need to do is the first thing you do is you need to shred your paper if you don't already have shredded paper. If you have access to a shredder at your work and they allow you to take that handfuls of it or whatever for free, that's up to you, as long as there's no security issues there. So what you can do is you can shred a blank sheet of paper. Yes, this is recycling, but it's also kind of strange because this is a brand new sheet of paper. I don't need to shred this because nothing's wrong with it. But if you want really clean white paper, whatever size you want and thickness you want, then you're going to need to shred something that's clean with no words on it. And then you could use something like this that has printing on it already, but I will warn you that if you use something with print already and you shred it, you're going to get black ink on it, and that black ink is then going to get inside the pulp, and you're not going to have pure white paper. Okay, so, and I'm okay with that. I don't really care. That's up to you. So I already shredded some. I'm not going to go through the shredding process, but I already shredded some. My shredder does these long strips, but if you've got a shredder that will do these small strips, like I've got some saved, I've got a box of this stuff. So I've got a box of recycled shreds of the small stuff, and then I've got the big stuff here. And then I've got a box for I've got a box for color paper, so I will have scraps of color paper that I will mix into this one, and I will make little containers like this full of a color. I'll have these containers back here. These are just paint buckets, plastic paint buckets that you can store your colors in and then refill these later if you need to. This is nice. I'll get to this later and what purpose of this is. So I'll recycle this stuff, still go through the shredder, same process, but since I have two blenders now, I can dedicate this one just to my color and then this one just to my white. Okay. All right, couple other things that you'll need. So you're going to need felt, and I'll explain the felt to you later on, but this is what the paper actually gets taken off the decal and the mold. Off the decal, it'll get put on the felt for either drying or for at least more decorating maybe, or if you're just sponge drying at the time. But just to get it off the decal, you're gonna need this felt. Okay, and these are already pre-cut. I think these are 9x12s. These are pre-cut to that size, and then I've got some cut that are roughly 18x18 that I will use for my 12x12. So I want a little extra room for error or whatnot, so I want a big sheet for my big sheet of paper. All right, so the process here, actually making pulp. When we make pulp, what we're going to do is, if you notice here, I've already got some paper and some water in here. It's been soaking a little bit, and if you know anything about paper, if you've ever dropped water on it or spilled something on paper, if you don't get it cleaned up in time and let it dry, it'll completely eat through the paper. The paper just goes right back to its natural state of the fibers that it was originally beat into. There are pulp machines. Maybe I'll put one of those on the screen so you can see one of those pulp machines. The university I went to had a pulp machine, and it just kind of like a kind of a racetrack, and on one side it's got a paddle. It looks like an old steamboat paddle, and the paper's going through, and that paddle's just beating that paper to a pulp, and it's just going round and round, making it softer and softer, smaller and smaller. And that's kind of the state that most paper starts off at, is that small, fine, seriously fine fibers. So Blender's not going to get it as close to those small fibers as it originally was, but we can get it down fine enough where we can make another sheet of paper. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend this up just a little bit, and then I might add some more paper. I'm going to have to add more paper. So in the tub of water that you're going to have, which I'll show you in a minute, you're going to have, however much water you have in there, there's a ratio of how much paper you want per how much water you want. It's also going to depend on how thick you want the paper, so on and so forth. There's a lot of variables. So I'm going to mix up a couple of these, and then I'm going to pour these into the bucket, so that way we can actually pull our sheet of paper with our decal and mold. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of this because we don't need this anymore. This is just shred. Okay, so this, let's see if we've got here, I want a puree. So what I'm going to check for is I'm going to look at the pulp inside here. I'm going to see how fine. If I see any big chunks, I'm going to hit it again. But before I hit it again, I'm going to drop some of the smaller, finer shreds in so I can get some more pulp. I'm going to look for water coming out. I'm going to look in here. I'm going to look at the fibers, see what's going on. If I feel it needs to be blended up, you can see, I don't know if you can see it on the screen very well, but it's got kind of a blackish, grayish top to it, and that's because of the ink. And again, for me, that doesn't bother me, at least not for what I'm going to be using this for. So it all depends on how white you want that to be, okay? And I'm using Liquify on this one. That's given me the finest chopping that I found. Puree was okay, but Liquify is the one that I'm going to use the most probably. Okay, so we got a little slurry of paper here. This is now Pulp, and this, if I were to pour this directly on my Declan mold, the water would go through the screen, and I would be left with just Pulp. Okay, so I've got my tub of water. This is just a tote. Make sure if you use a tote, there's no holes in the bottom. We want to make sure that there's no leaking. That would just be a waste of water and a big mess. So make sure that you've got no holes in whatever bucket or container that you're using for this. Make sure that it's big enough where your Declan mold will fit at least most of the way down. This is going to fit just fine. I didn't submerge it all the way, but I'm going to end up doing this with it and then pulling up, and then what will be left is the paper inside this mold. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the Pulp. So I'm just going to pour in that Pulp. Kind of makes a little cloud. I'm going to rinse out your container, and you see that little cloud happening there. And I need to add more, so you got to make sure that you add enough Pulp to this to be able to pull a full sheet of paper. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a smaller sheet of paper first, and we'll go through this process, and maybe I'll pull a bigger piece as well, but I'm set up for small ones right now, so I'm going to do that first. So what we want to do is you want to make sure that this is all kind of, all the Pulp isn't sitting on the bottom. You want to make sure this is up and moving around, and then we're going to make sure your mold is on. We're going to go down and then pull it up, and all that paper, you want to shake it back and forth a little bit, back and forth, and try to even that paper out. I'm going to drain that water. You don't want to tip it too soon, otherwise all the paper is going to run to that one side that you tip it, but eventually you do want to tip to get rid of more of that water. Alright, so now what I need to do with my future sheet of paper here is I need to take it over to my felt, and I'll show you that process next. Now that I brought my Declan mold over here, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wet my felt, because if the felt's dry, it won't necessarily stick, the paper won't necessarily stick to the felt, and we need it to come off the decal. So we need this damp. Doesn't have to be soaking, but it needs to be damp. Again, you need to be in an area where you can make a mess somewhat. It needs to be able to be wet. This is a very wet process. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove the mold, and you can see that's our shape of our paper. And there's two different things here. So if you see, you can tilt this, it's not going anywhere, it's not falling off, right? See, that's just the overflow of the edge coming up, so it's just a little thicker in that spot. It's not a big deal. And what we want to do is there's a certain process. There's a couple different ways, because we've got this white screen on the back, which is actually from a light tile you can pick up from Home Depot. They come in, I think, 24 by 36 or 36 by 48 or something like that. You can cut them to fit whatever size if you want to do that. This kind of just keeps the screen flat on the front so it doesn't sink in and doesn't get warped over time. So this just keeps it flat. But the bad part about this is that I can't sponge the back while it's on here. So I have to rely on the rock method. So I have to kind of push down on this. I'm going to push down rock and it should come up. If my felt is wet enough, it should just come right up and we'll see what happens. Okay. Yeah, there's our sheet of paper. So it worked just good, or just perfect. So what I needed to do is I needed to, as I rocked down, I pushed down on this back screen, and then I rocked up and I put enough pressure on the paper to stick to that felt. Okay, so now I've got my sheet of paper, and there's a couple different ways to dry a sheet of paper or press it or whatnot. So the sponge would be, if I didn't have this white screen on the back, I would be sponging to push down and get that water and the paper, the fibers to attach to that felt. Okay, I didn't need it for that purpose, but I will show you if I dry this on a piece of wood or I dry this on stainless steel or something. If you dry it on something smooth, that's where it will dry. All the moisture will eventually be pulled out of it, and you will be left with a dry sheet of paper stuck to whatever it is that you stick it to. Preferably a window, a piece of plexiglass, something like that, and then you just let it dry and you peel it off, and then I can go over the process or what happens to it when you do it that way. The other way is another method I've got to work on, because you can get a press, a paper press, that you will then take your sheet of paper, right, and then you will put another piece of felt on top of it, and then you will put another piece of felt on top of that with another piece of paper, another piece of felt, so on and so forth. You stack up a bunch of pieces of paper and you put them in a press, and then you tighten down the press slowly, and it slowly kind of squeezes out the water. And then you would end up just taking that off to the side and leaving it to dry. And then when it's done drying, you've got all your paper and they're neatly pressed, and they all have the same texture. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the plexiglass or the window method of drying, and you can see that process first. All right, so what I've got is a piece of plexiglass here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay the plexi down, and you can treat this like if it was a window as well, because you can do this standing up. It can be vertical when you put this on. You just have to be a little more careful when it's a vertical piece of glass. I don't have to be as careful on this. You want to make sure it's free of any debris, especially if you don't want your paper picking up any other colors. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to carefully lay this down. Okay, and then I'm going to take my sponge and I'm going to sponge on the back. That's going to soak up a little bit of the water, but it's also going to start to help it come off of the felt when I'm ready to lift it up. And it's pressing it as well. What will happen with this is you will have two different textures, unless you used two pieces of plexiglass, and that gets tricky because then you don't know if it's going to rip it apart. If you do a piece of plexiglass paper and then plexiglass and have the same texture on both sides, that can get dicey. So I don't recommend it, but you can try it if you want to experiment. What I'm going to do now is try and lift up. See how my paper is coming right up off, or the felt's coming right off the paper. Done. Right? So now what I would do, so my piece of paper is going to dry just like this. I'm going to go set this in the corner somewhere, let it dry, and then come back and I'll show you what it looks like. You can see there's little bumps, and I'm not pressing it fully, so it's not going to be a completely smooth sheet of paper. I don't know if you can also see, but there's little black flecks in here, or gray flecks, from the ink that was on the recycled paper. So again, if you want a clean white sheet of paper, don't use recycled already printed on paper. Okay, so I'm going to go let that dry, and then I'll show you maybe another process, because we've got color paper to deal with as well. All right, so I pulled another sheet of paper on the little guy here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of paint with some blended up black. So I just shredded some black paper, I put it in my color blender, and I blended this up, and now I can, and I made sure that I've got a decent sized hole, because pulp needs to come out. Sometimes there's big chunks, and you got to be careful painting like that too, because sometimes a big blob will come out and you don't want that, and you want it to be finer, so you have to be careful. There's a fine balance. So if you use like cookie cutters like this, whatever kind of cookie cutter you want, you know, let's think this is a sandwich cutter, maybe it's a cookie cutter, but anyways, you know, you can use anything like this to create a stencil. You can cut out cardboard and have a stencil of whatever cutout you decide to make. There's an author who makes all of her books out of paper making. Like, she makes all of her own paper, and then she makes her own stencils, and she's got a cool press, because it's not a press that presses a sheet of paper like a physical press. It's a vacuum. She puts it in like this bag, and it vacuums all the water out and dries the paper, and then she sends it off to, I believe she sends it off to the publisher, and they take photographs of it and they print the books that way. Really neat process. All right, and then you can simply just paint or write a name or something if you wanted to, or you can use little cookie cutters. These little cookie cutters add nice little stencils. You got to be careful you don't go push too hard in it. You don't want to go too soft in it. There's a balance. This will most likely bleed into the white, so you have to either be prepared for that or be careful with it, one of the two. So I'm just going to add a couple little designs here, and then we'll hopefully rock it off, and it'll go smooth. Most of what I'm getting right now is just water. It's not the actual pulp. I'm going to shake it up a second here. And if you have the ability to put some in a little dish and use like a palette knife or something to gently place the pulp where you want to, then that's an option as well. Okay. So I'm kind of like dyeing the paper the black color. I'm not using a whole lot of pulp. It all depends on the look that you're trying to go for. And you give it a second here, and you just let it kind of soak in before you take the stencil off. And you can check and see, because it'll be dark at first, and then it'll kind of soak in or go through the screen as well, because we haven't taken it off the screen yet. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is get my felt ready, and I'm going to spray it down. Alright, so I'm going to take my mold off. I got my sheet of paper, and I'm going to try and remember, when you rock it, you've got to hold the felt down when you start pulling up on the other end. So I'm going to give it a little push on the middle. There we go. Remember, this is the back side. So you can see where some of that color was going. It was traveling alongside these the grid that's in there. And then when we flip this over, we'll see the actual design. You know, what I think I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to put a book on it. Of course, not one that either I care about, or I'll put a piece of plastic in between because I don't want my book to get wet. Okay, what I'm going to get ready for is a big sheet. So I'm going to get ready for a big sheet of paper here. I'm going to do the 12 by 12. Move some of these things, and I'll explain some of those accessories in a minute. I'm going to have my felt down. Okay. And I'm going to spray this down. Okay. These came off of the plexiglass. So on this side, and of course you probably can't see it real well, if at all, this side is fairly smooth. There is a little texture, and the texture is because these are the kind of little bubbles that were there, and they weren't touching the plexi. But if it's actually pressed against the plexi, it'll be super smooth. And then this side is textured. So go enjoy the process and have fun.